Good evening. Welcome to tonight's event of the User Experience Speaker Series. My name is Tran Zhou, and I'm the chair of the Department of Technical Communication and Interaction Design at Metropolitan State University. I'm also the director of the Graduate Certificate in the Design of User Experience. This speaker series features the great minds in design thinking and user experience. We strive to connect the latest insights from industry with our learners and the university community. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, David Thomas. His talk will focus on design for cognitive bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. David is the author of Design for Cognitive Bias, creator and host of the Cognitive Bias podcast, and a 20-year practitioner of content strategy and user experience. Please welcome David.
Hello. Thank you all for coming out tonight. So tonight we're going to talk about design for cognitive bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. I am David Dylan Thomas. I founded a company where I basically go around and get people excited about and give them better tools for more inclusive design. And I did, in fact, write this book, Design for Cognitive Bias. And the road to this book began with a podcast I used to do called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. And the road to that podcast actually begins with this woman. Her name is Iris Bohnet. And she gave a talk once called Gender Equality by Design, which is a fantastic talk. You can find it on YouTube. And in it, she kind of looks at this idea that a lot of implicit racial and gender bias can sometimes come back to something as simple as pattern recognition. So think, for example, that you are hiring a web developer, and the image that pops into your head when I say the words web developer might be skinny white guy. And it's not because you think that men are better at programming than women, far from it, but the pattern that you may have seen in movies, in television, maybe even in some offices you've worked in, starts to make that equation. So if you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit the pattern, all of a sudden you're giving that resume the side eye. Now, when I saw that something as terrible as racial or gender bias could sometimes come back to something as simple and, dare I say, as human as pattern recognition, I decided I need to learn everything I possibly can about cognitive bias. And so I did. This is the Rational Wiki page of cognitive biases. There's well over 100 here, and I realized I am not going to figure this out in a day. So I took one a day. And the next day I would move on to the next one. And this inevitably turned me into the guy who wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And so eventually my friend said, Dave, please just get a podcast. So let's start with the basics. What is cognitive bias? And at the end of the day, it's really just a series of shortcuts your mind is taking just to get through the day. We have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every single day. Even right now, I'm making decisions about where to look, what to do with my hands, how fast to talk. And if I thought carefully about every single one of these decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that a lot of our lives are spent on autopilot. But unfortunately, the autopilot sometimes gets it wrong. And we call those errors cognitive biases. So here's a fun one. It's called illusion of control. And it happens when you are playing a game where you have to roll a die. And if you need a really high number, you tend to roll the die really hard. And if you need a lower number, you tend to roll the die gently, right? And it makes no difference how hard you roll the die. But in situations where we don't have control, we like to feel like we have control. And we embody that by how hard we roll the die. Now, this next one is not so fun. It's called confirmation bias. And it happens when we get an idea stuck in our head and we really only look for evidence to support that idea. And if we ever see evidence that doesn't support that idea, we yell fake news and we move on. So a really powerful example of this came during the lead up to the Iraq War. The whole idea was Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. We needed to get in there and get him before he gets us. It seemed very compelling. As it turns out, not so much with the weapons of mass destruction. And within a year, the president of the United States, who had insisted, yeah, there are weapons of mass destruction there, said, yeah, we didn't find anything. Regardless, the number of people who believed there were weapons of mass destruction there stayed very high, so high that even 14 years later, over 50% of Republicans and over 30% of Democrats were like, yeah, there were weapons of mass destruction there. So this is an extremely powerful bias, and we are going to come back to it. Now, part of the problem is that a lot of these biases are really hard to fight because you may not even realize you have them. There's literally a bias called the bias blind spot. And the way it works is you think you don't have any biases, but you're sure that everybody else does. And part of the problem is that about 95% of cognition is happening below the threshold of conscious thought. So these decisions are happening so quickly, you don't even realize you've made them. So the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you know about the bias, you probably still do it anyway. So there's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could ask everybody on this call to write down the last 2 numbers of your phone number. And then I could say, we're going to bid on this bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down lower numbers, probably going to bid lower. Those of you who wrote down higher numbers, probably going to bid higher. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. But here's the thing. I could tell you all of that before we begin the experiment. Still do it. In fact, I could say, I will pay you cash money not to do that. And still do it. Now, the reason we need to care about bias is something called choice architecture. And you can see it play out if you ever go buy produce. The common wisdom is you never pick from the top of the barrel, because that is where the grocer is going to put the product they're most trying to get rid of, right? The oldest product. And they have architected that situation to benefit themselves. Now, they could just as easily architect it to benefit the customer by putting the freshest produce where it's easiest to reach. But either way that they architect that experience affects the decisions you make in that experience. So think about the decisions your user needs to make. And then think about how people make decisions, right? Not how a rational person makes decisions, but how someone who's making 95% of their decisions without realizing it. How do they make decisions? And it turns out there are content and design choices that we can make to help keep some of those biases at bay, or maybe even sometimes use them for good. So let's go back to that skinny white guy. As it turns out, in experiment after experiment, if you have 2 identical resumes and the only difference is the name at the top of the resume, if it is a female sounding name, it tends to stay on the pile. If it is a male sounding name, it tends to keep going through the process. But here's the thing. Why do you need that information? What about the name is helping you, the hiring manager, figure out who to hire? Think of it like a signal to noise problem, right? The signal, the thing that might actually help you decide are things like the qualifications or the experience. The noise that might actually get in the way are things like gender and race, or really what you're reading into the name in terms of the gender and race. Now, the city of Philadelphia did in fact do a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer position. Found out a couple of things. One, the best way to anonymize a resume, even in the high-tech world of web development, is to physically print out the resume, get a marker, and redact it like a CIA document. The next thing that they discovered is that once they found a resume they liked, they would want to go to GitHub, which is a code repository, to kind of see that web developer's portfolio. Of course, once they actually saw that web developer's profile, all the personal information would be there and ruin the experiment. So clever people that they were, they created a little Chrome plugin, a program that would anonymize that information as the page loaded. And then just to complete the circle, they took that code and they put it back on GitHub, and it's there now if you ever want to try this yourself. Now, this isn't just about helping humans make hiring decisions. Amazon had a hiring bot, right, that was meant to sift through thousands of resumes, but it turned out to be extremely sexist. So sexist that if it even saw the name of a woman's college on a resume, it would downgrade that resume. So when they tried to figure out how did this bot become so sexist, they asked themselves, well, how did we train it? Well, they trained it on the prior 10 years of resumes to Amazon, which may seem like a reasonable thing to do until you realize, what do most of those resumes have in common? It's mostly guys. And so the bot took one look at that, said, gee, I sure must like dudes, and then just kept recommending dudes. We like to think of AI as this cold, rational, objective machine, when in fact it's more of a glorified prediction engine. And if you point it at a racist and sexist world, it will make racist and sexist predictions. Now, this can go in the opposite direction, right? Amazon Go is a store where you walk in, you take what you want, and you leave. And Amazon will automatically deduct whatever you took from your account. This had a really curious effect for Ashley Clark Thompson, who wrote an article for CNET called "In Amazon Go, No One Thinks I'm Stealing." And what she's referring to here is a phenomenon known as shopping while black, which manifests this kind of hyper-aggressive customer service. Can I help you? No, really, can I help you? In Amazon Go, there was no one there to do that to Ashley. And so by removing one key design element, namely the staff, Amazon created a less biased experience for this shopper. This even spreads out to the judicial system. In the judicial system, district attorneys generally have incredible leeway when it comes to deciding whether or not to bring charges when a crime has been committed. Perhaps not surprisingly, they are more likely to bring charges when the accused is Black than if the accused is white, even for the same crimes. So similar to the resumes, they said, well, why do you need that information? So they started producing crime reports that omitted the race of the accused, the race of the victim, and even the location of the crime to try to get less biased decisions out of the DA. Another key term here is cognitive fluency. And it's this idea that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, we'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's probably easy to do. By the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's probably hard to do. I don't know about you, but I have been making a lot of pancakes lately, and this is a recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of small, kind of clumped together. And I might glance at that and think, you know what, I bet pancakes are kind of hard to make. I don't know if I'm going to make pancakes. Now I can take the same text, give it big full width imagery and break it out into smaller, more scannable bursts of text. And I might glance at that and think, you know what, I bet pancakes aren't that hard to make. Maybe I'll make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget about it, we're making pancakes. Now think about how that plays out if I'm trying to decide whether or not to drive or take public transportation. I take one look at that printed schedule and I immediately conclude public transportation is impossible. I am not going to do it. I take a look at that app screen and I think, you know what, maybe it's not that hard. Maybe I'll give it a shot. Now I can't see your faces, so I'm going to ask you all to vote in your hearts. How many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1912? Okay, how many of you think that Rosa Parks was born in 1914? Okay, you're both wrong. She was born in 1913, but people tend to pick 1914. Reason being, if something is easier to read, we actually think it's more true, but it gets worse. If it rhymes, we actually think it's more true. And this has consequences. Now, what we think is going on here is that we like things that are easier to process. Things that are easier to process feel more certain. If I asked you, what did you have? What did you get for your 5th birthday? You got a toy truck, right? You might not feel too certain about that answer, right? It's hard to remember. It's hard to process. It doesn't feel very certain. If I said, hey, what did you have for breakfast this morning? You might feel pretty certain about that answer. It's easy to remember. It's easy to process. It feels pretty certain. Things that rhyme are easier to remember, easier to process. They feel more certain. Things that use big, bold fonts and clear imagery and clear language are easier to process. They feel more certain. Now, this becomes important when it comes to things that we need to believe. In America, we have a crisis where African Americans, generally speaking, do not believe health information that comes from the government. In a 2002 survey, when given the statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only 37% of African American respondents agreed with that statement. By the time you get to 2016, that number has dropped to 18%. Now, we could do a whole other talk about why there are legit reasons that African Americans have concerns about health information that comes from the government. But the fact remains, this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language and pictograms, so be it. Now, when I first put this in the book, my editor very wisely challenged me on it and said, that's great in theory, but can you point to actual instances where plain language and pictograms have saved lives? And I'm glad she did, because it forced me to do the work. And here's what I found. So here's a situation where we have women who are smoking while pregnant. And when they were given materials written at the 3rd grade reading level, right, easier to process, they were more likely to stop smoking while pregnant and even 6 weeks postpartum. Another example, you have people who are caregivers, right, helping other people take their medication. And when they had a plain language pictogram-based intervention, there were decreased medication dosing errors and improved adherence to actually taking the medication. Now you might think, okay, that's great for plain language and pictograms, but rhyming, really? Let's talk about Click It or Ticket. Here in the States, a whole bunch of states a while back started rolling out legislation that said if you do not buckle your seatbelt, you can get a ticket. And the legislation on its own did a lot of good, especially with older drivers, but not as much with the younger drivers. So they rolled out Click It or Ticket, and the results were that national belt use among young men and women aged 16 to 24 went from 65% to 72%, and from 73% to 80% respectively. Now, just to put that in more human terms, for every percentage point you go up and people actually buckling their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So roughly speaking, that's about 4,000 lives saved in part through rhyming. It's silly, but it works. The whole easy to process thing even extends to names. There's literally a name pronunciation effect where if your name is easier to pronounce, it can affect things like voting preferences, occupational status, with the caveat that easy to pronounce is a culturally specific thing, right? In some cultures, Smith is easier to pronounce. In some cultures, Mbimo is easier to pronounce. But if your name is easier to pronounce in the culture you're in, you kind of got it made. They looked at law firms. And the higher up you went the rank in the law firms, the easier the names got to pronounce. This even extends to stocks, right? If you have an IPO and your stock is about to launch, go public, if the name of the stock is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. If even the little stock ticker abbreviation is easier to pronounce, it tends to perform better. So we will lay real money down on things that are easier to process. Now, the most dangerous bias in the world for my money is the framing effect. And the way it works is, let's say you go into a store and you see a sign that says beef 95% lean, and next to it is a sign that says beef 5% fat. Which one do you think people are going to line up for? It's the same thing. I just framed one in a way to make it seem more appealing. Now, that's all good and well when we're talking about beef, but what if I were to say, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? See what I did there? We're no longer talking about if we should go to war in the first place. And wars have been started over less. Now, if you are bilingual, multilingual, you have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you can think about the decision in your non-primary language, you're less likely to fall for the scam. So I speak a little bit of French. So if I were to try to think about the beef decision in French, it would go something like, let's see, beef, that's boeuf, that is a lot of vowels. 95%, that's 89, no wait, that's not right. And by the time I've done all that processing, I can see right through the scam. Now, it turns out that the framing effect can also be used for good. There is an experiment where you show an audience a photo like this and you ask, should this person drive this car? And what you get is basically a policy discussion, right? And some people are saying, oh, people are bad at everything. Don't let them drive. And other people are saying, how dare you? That's ageist. Let people do what they want. All you learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now you can show the same photo to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what you'll get is basically a design discussion. Some people might say, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? Or what if we move the dashboard? And what you'll learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. I only changed 2 words, but by changing the frame of the conversation, I changed the entire conversation. In fact, what if I zoom out a little more and ask, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why she was in the car in the first place. She was here, but she wanted to be there. And if we frame it this way, things like public transportation are on the table. The whole framing effect thing even extends to academia, right? So student evaluations of professors is yet another area where you see women at a disadvantage. Students tend to rate their female professors lower than their male counterparts, even for the same coursework. Iowa State University took a look at this and said, okay, let's do an experiment where some of the students get a couple paragraphs before they fill out the survey. And those paragraphs basically say what I just said. This is an area where women are generally at a disadvantage. Please, when you are filling this out, make sure you use real criteria and not things like appearance. The students who got those 2 paragraphs tended to rate their female professors higher than the students who did not. I want to close by talking about our biases because these are the ones that can really get our users in trouble. So let's talk about notational bias. Notational bias comes out when you think about things like sheet music. I played the saxophone when I was a kid, so I grew up having to learn how to read music like this. And I came to believe that any music in the world, you could write it down like this, standard Western notation, write it down like this, and then I could play it. But it turns out that's wrong. It's very wrong. There is a lot of Asian music, African music, for which this system just doesn't work. And if this becomes the standard, it can be very easy to erase all sorts of culture. Something we might be more familiar with is when we're asking for personal information. If I have it in my head that there's only 2 genders and I create my forms that way, it is easy for me to eradicate any number of identities. By the way, while we're on the topic of asking for personal information, you should know about something called the self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is where if something goes right, that's my fault. If something goes wrong, that's your fault. And we see this play out with humans and computers. If I'm doing something on a computer and something goes wrong, I'll blame the computer. And if something goes right, I'll blame myself, unless I've given the computer a lot of personal information. The more personal information I give the computer, the more likely I am to blame myself if something goes wrong and the computer if something goes right. So we need to be very thoughtful just how often we ask for personal information, because the more we do it, the more we might be creating this unhealthy dynamic between people and their technology. Now, notational bias plays out a lot in structured content and editorial guidelines. Until 1986, the New York Times prohibited the use of Ms. as an honorific for women. The way that would work is at the first mention of a woman's name in an article, you would say her full name, and then every mention after that, it would be either Miss last name or Mrs. last name. Now, think about the pattern that sets up, and remember how important patterns are. In article after article, it sets up this pattern that the most important thing to know about a woman is whether or not she's married, and then maybe her last name. So think about that. In article after article for over 100 years, we need to be very thoughtful how we structure our content and what kind of editorial guidelines we create, because that is a super easy way to scale bias. Language doesn't just describe reality, it shapes it. And this is legally true. Back in the day, you have Vice President Dick Cheney. He gets the job and he asks his lawyers basically what he can get away with. And they say, look, you are the vice president, which means you are a member of the executive branch. But you also cast the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, which means you're also part of the legislative branch. But wait a minute, you can't be a part of the executive branch and a part of the legislative branch. So maybe you're not a part of either. And if you're not a part of either, well, then maybe you don't have to follow the rules of either. And he didn't. The same thing plays out today with software like Facebook. When it suits them, right, Facebook will position itself as a publisher. Hey, New York Times, come publish with us. We get you. When someone points out that there are rules for publishers, it's all, oh, I don't know if you heard, buddy, we're a platform. Now, there are tools out there to help us write more inclusively. One of them is Radical Copy Editor, and it really helps you think about how to write for folks who usually don't get a lot of say in how they are written about. Another one is Textio, which is really good for writing more inclusive job descriptions, because not everybody wants to be a ninja or a rock star. Another thing to think about is evidentiality, and it's something that you see in some languages. English, not so much, but other languages have it. So it has to do with the verb tense. In English, verb tense is mostly there to tell you when something happened, right? Bob went to the store, Bob is going to the store, Bob will go to the store. Other languages like Turkish make their verb tense do a little more heavy lifting, right? So there's one verb tense, the verb tense is there basically to let you know how I know that Bob went to the store, right? So there's one verb tense for I personally saw Bob go to the store. There's a whole other verb tense for somebody told me that Bob went to the store. And then a whole other verb tense for, I don't know, I read on the internet that Bob went to the store. Point is, I can't tell you that Bob went to the store without also telling you how I know Bob went to the store. Now think about how that would affect what people are willing to post online, or what they were willing to say in a speech, if they literally couldn't say it without also saying how they knew it to be true. Now, English lacks this as a mandatory feature, but I think we can start to get creative about how to use design to introduce it. Now, remember how we said that if something is easier to read, it feels more true? Well, the same works in reverse. If something is a little harder to read, it's a little harder to believe. So this is an actual article that came out when the first teaser trailer dropped for the new 007 film. And the first paragraph is full of confirmable information, right? This is the name of the movie. This is who's in it. The second paragraph is a rumor about why the first director got fired. First paragraph, it's pretty easy to read. It's pretty easy to believe. Second paragraph, it's a little harder to read, a little harder to believe, and it should be, it's a rumor. So I can think we can start to get a little more creative about how we let our users know how many grains of salt they should be taking some of their content with. I told you we'd come back to this one. So I'm going to tell you a story about how I misinterpreted or misunderstood the scientific method. I used to think that it was, I have a theory about how the world works. I am going to test that theory. I'm going to write down what I did. And if I get a good result, a whole bunch of other people are going to try the same thing. If they get a good result, then great. Check that off. That's a law. Let's move on. After talking to some actual scientists, I found out it's a little more complicated than that. I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test that idea, write down everything I did. If I get a good result, a whole bunch of other people are going to try the exact same thing. If they get the same result, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Okay, let me go and try and prove that. Now, that is a much more rigorous approach, and it was created specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, as designers, it is remarkably easy for us to leave good design on the table because we fall in love with our first idea. Let me show you how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game of the computer, and the computer is going to show us these numbers and that question mark, and it's going to say, put whatever number you want. Where the question mark is, I'll tell you if that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like, and when you're ready, tell me what you think the pattern is. If you're like me, say, I'm going to guess 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, nah, I got this. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says no. And the reason it says no is because I never tried this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is simply every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution. Probably easier to code, probably cheaper to build, but I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. But there are tools out there to help us avoid this outcome. One of them is called Red Team, Blue Team. And the idea is you have a blue team who does the initial research, maybe gets as far as a prototype or a wireframe, but before they go any further, the red team comes in for one day, and their job is to go to war with the blue team. They're there to find every hidden assumption, every more elegant solution, every potential cause of harm that the blue team missed because they were so in love with their first idea. Now, one of the things I like about this approach is that it's fairly cost effective. I don't have to go to my boss and say, hey, for every project now, we got to spin up 2 teams and they got to check each other's work every single day. No, I need one team for one day to make it a little less likely that we're going to put something harmful out into the world. The other thing I like about this approach is that it highlights the value of outside perspectives. This is Norman Ohler. He wrote a book called Blitzed, which is about Nazis on drugs. And it begins with a German DJ friend of his who said that when he was a boy growing up in Munich, all the World War II vets would talk about how they were on drugs all the time. Norman takes his friend at his word, does the research, and sure enough, the Nazis kept meticulous records. This is what they were giving the soldiers, basically meth. This is what they were giving Hitler, basically oxy. Oh, and by the way, here's what they were giving the German populace. Now, World War II is not an understudied conflict, right? Lots of books, and yet none of them mention this. Why? My personal theory, the Venn diagram of historians and people with familiarity with recreational drug use is fairly thin. And if our German DJ friend had gone up to one of your average historians and said, hey, did you know the Nazis were on drugs? A lot of those historians would have said, okay, whatever, junkie. But Norman, also familiar with recreational drug use, takes his friend at his word. Now, the point is, if you were to say, hey, Dave, we're writing a book about World War II, who should we talk to? My first answer wouldn't be a German DJ, but it would be a great answer. Part of the problem we have with design is thinking about the unhappy path. And part of that simply has to do with how we sell design, right? When we are pitching someone on a website redesign, we never say, hey, here's all the stuff that could go wrong. No, we say, hey, you're gonna have all these cool new features and it's gonna be so much easier for people to buy stuff and blah, blah, blah. But for any cool new feature that could go right, there's at least 5 things that could go wrong. So we should spend at least as much time designing for those outcomes. Part of the problem we have with thinking about the unhappy path is this thing called the survivorship bias. And you can see it play out in the story of Abraham Wald. Abraham Wald was a brilliant mathematician in Austria in the 1930s, but unfortunately he was a Jewish mathematician in Austria in the 1930s, and his life was in danger. So he managed to get out before the Nazis moved in, and he ended up in the States, where he was asked to help with the war effort. And one of the problems he was asked to solve was, we've got all these planes, they're getting shot down. Where can we put more armament on these planes to keep them from getting shot down so much? And they put him in a hangar with a bunch of planes that all have bullet holes and a bunch of other scientists. And a lot of the scientists are saying, look, this isn't rocket science. Just you see where the bullet holes are, put more armament there. But our friend Abraham says, wait a minute, that's actually where you shouldn't put the armament. You need to put the armament where you don't see the bullet holes. Reason being, he realized they were looking at the planes that were shot up, but not shot up so bad that they couldn't make it back. They needed to worry about the planes that were shot so bad that they never made it back. And those planes were clearly shot where these planes were not. So they were thinking about the survivors. They weren't thinking about the ones that weren't so lucky. Now, a good tool for thinking about the unhappy path is speculative design. And you can see it play out in the show Black Mirror, which if you haven't seen it, it's kind of a Twilight Zone for tech. You take some near future technology and you tell a story about what would happen if real human beings got their hands on it. And the result is always horrible. I think anybody by law working on a new technology should by law have to write a Black Mirror episode about it first. But this is a real job. The folks at Superflux went down to the United Arab Emirates to help them think about the future of energy. And the question on the table was, should we stay on the road of fossil fuels, or should we start investing in renewables? So one of the things that Superflux did was to say, okay, let's figure out what your air quality is going to be like if you stay on the road of fossil fuels 5 years out, 10 years out, 20 years out. But they didn't just figure it out. They bottled it. And then they made them breathe it. And by the time it gets even 10 years out, it is unbreathable. By the end of that engagement, the UAE announced they were going to invest over $150 billion in renewables. Another great thing to do kind of at the outset of a project to kind of get all your biases out on the table, it's called an assumption audit. And what you do is before you kick off, you get your whole team in a room and you ask these 5 questions. First, what identities does your team represent? Now, you're only going to self-identify as you feel comfortable, but you're thinking about things like gender or age or income. Then you ask, how might those identities influence the design of this experience? Then you ask, well, who's not in the room, right? Anybody here ever been incarcerated? Anybody here ever had their immigration status questioned? Then you ask, how might the absence of those perspectives compromise the design of this thing we're working on? Finally, you ask, what might we do to include, honor, and give power to those voices in the design process? And I choose those words carefully. Include, yes, certainly talk to people. Honor, maybe pay them for their time. Give power. Are there people who are going to be impacted by this design who have no say in this design? And how do we give them more say? Because they have to live with what we make. Now, a really neat example of this came from the show The Mandalorian, which is this, if you haven't seen it, it's the sci-fi TV show, and there's this alien race that speaks mostly in sign language. And one of the actors said, hey, I have a friend who is, in fact, a deaf actor. Maybe we should have them come in and work on this. And they ended up developing this great sort of alien sign language. And what I love about this tweet is at the end, he says, it's our responsibility when we're in the room to look around and see who's missing. Now, when we're trying to figure out who we should invite to the table, a really good thing to think about is power and participatory design. Participatory design is an approach to design that really thinks carefully about how power plays out through the design process. So one of the first things you do if you're going to take this approach is something called a power map, which is what you're looking at right now. And along the x-axis, you're basically charting out who has low interest, right? Who doesn't really care about this project because they're not really going to be impacted by it. And on the other end, high interest, who really cares about it because they're really going to be impacted by it. And then along the y-axis, you're looking at power, right? Who has very little say in how this design works out? And on the other end, who has all the say? And what you're looking for are people who fall into that lower right quadrant. They are very impacted by the work, but they have no say in it. So an example might be some work that the city of Philadelphia did with the Office of Homeless Services. And they are redesigning the intake program for people who are experiencing homelessness. Now, the people who have going to be very impacted by that work, but have zero say in the work, are the people experiencing homelessness. And the whole project of participatory design comes from that point on. How do we give them more say? How do we move them into the upper right where they have they're impacted, but they have a lot of say? And a lot of that comes back to just commitment and accountability, right? I'm not just going to talk to some people experiencing homelessness, go away and never see them again. No, I'm going to synthesize that research. I'm going to come back and say, did we get this right? And if we didn't, we're not done yet. And the same thing with the design. I'm going to co-design. I'm not going to design at them. I'm going to design with them. And again, before that design is considered final, I'm going to say, hey, did we get this right? If not, we're not done yet. And finally, before we implement anything, that's right, did we get this right? And if we didn't, we're not done yet. We're not implementing anything. And again, we're doing all of this because they have to live with what we build. Now, a really neat example of this comes from Montana State University. The library there was grappling with this problem. There was a considerable indigenous population at that university, but they weren't really using the libraries. They were like, well, how do we solve this? And they could have taken the approach to just say, hey, let's build an app. We know what we're doing. Let's just make something. But instead, they decided to co-design and do a participatory design project with some of the Native American students at the university. One of the things they discovered out of the gate was you don't need an app. You need posters, and they need to go here, here, and here, right? And then they created those posters with those students for a more impactful design. And one of my favorite quotes here is one of the quotes that inspired them. It's, how do we build a university that deserves Indigenous people, right? There's a certain humility in that and saying, not we're going to solve some problem for you, but we need to make the thing that is deserving of you. The final bias I want to talk about is called déformation professionnelle. Told you I speak French. This is a bias where you see the whole world through the lens of your job, which in the workaholic world, a lot of us occupy might seem like a good idea, right up until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road that night probably thought they were doing a good job. And technically speaking, they were. They were getting really difficult to get photographs that were going to fetch them a really high price. What they weren't doing such a good job of was being human beings. Now, the former police commissioner of Philadelphia, a guy named Ramsey, when he took the job, he asks all of his officers the same question. What do you think your job is? And a lot of them say to enforce the law. And he says, okay, that seems like a reasonable answer, but what if I told you your job is to protect civil rights? Now that encompasses enforcing the law, but it's a bigger job because it forces you to treat people with dignity. I have had this slide in here for a while, and every year it gets harder to get through, but I keep it in here because now more than ever, it is clear how we define our jobs is a matter of life and death. Ramsey was telling his officers that day that their jobs were harder than they think. And I'm here to tell us, our jobs are harder than we think. It's not just design cool shit. We have to find a way to define our jobs that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, there are folks who are working on this. Mike Montero at Mule Design, it's got this little design ethics booklet that's basically a Hippocratic oath for designers of first do no harm. The Design Justice Network does amazing work in this area. And they've got these 10 key principles. I'm just going to read you the first two. 1, we use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. 2, we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. Now, if you just stick to those first two, you have got your work cut out for you. It's the difference between what Erica Hall calls user-centered design versus shareholder-centered design. We often think we're doing the former when in fact we're kind of doing the latter. Now, what gives me hope in all of this is that the solve is there, right? These aren't mysteries of the universe that are unknowable. No, we've been looking at how to solve these kind of gnarly ethical problems for a long time. The study of moral philosophy and ethics has been with us for thousands of years. And folks like the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics does a really good job of distilling all of that wisdom into key questions you can ask about your work. Which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? That's the utilitarian approach. Which option leads me to act as the sort of person I want to be? That's the virtual approach. All this wisdom is there. We just have to start making it a part of our process. Another really good tool for this is the Tarot Cards of Tech, which is this website you go to and there are these cards and you click them and they flip over and give you these really provocative questions about your work. How might cultural habits change how your product is used? And how might your product change cultural habits? If Twitter had asked itself this before it launched, we might live in a very different world today. Even software engineers are getting in on this. There's the Never Again pledge that a lot of data scientists and software engineers got together and signed when they saw that their work with data was being used to hurt immigrants. And they pointed to a long and sordid history of data being used to hurt excluded populations. And they said, we don't want to be a part of that history. And here's a list of things we are willing to do to make sure that never happens, up to and including destroying unethical data sets. This kind of collective action is even showing up in places like Google, where there was Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI. When the people working on it saw what it was, they said, we did not get into this business to build weapons. And if you make us work on this, we're going to walk. And it worked. Google walked away from a $250 million contract. And then they turned right around and did Project Dragonfly, which is censored search in China. So this battle continues to be fought. Now, if you were thinking of taking up this battle yourself where you work, you should know about the consistency bias. And the way the consistency bias works is if I come up to you and I say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're probably going to say no. But if I say, hey, can I put this tiny, you're not even going to notice it. This is a little tiny. More likely to say yes. If you say yes, and I come back a couple weeks later and I say, hey, can I put this big giant sign on your lawn? You're actually more likely to say yes because you're sign people now. We like to make decisions that are consistent with our former decisions. So if I want to roll out inclusive design at my company, I could say, hey, we're going to form the inclusive design committee and we're going to meet every Monday and we're going to overhaul the entire design process. It's basically going to be a meeting engine. Or I could say, hey, boss, on this next project, can we do an assumption audit? It takes like 2 hours. This is like a 600-hour project. Well, it's 2 hours. More likely to say yes. If they say yes, and I do that on 3-4 projects, and I come back and I say, hey, on this next project, can we do a red team? It's like 1 day. This is like a 90-day project. Just in 1 day. More likely to say yes because, well, I guess we're inclusive design people now. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this is not some software guru giving a TED Talk. It's Martin Luther King. Over 50 years ago, he saw this to be true, and it is only more true today. So the question I will leave all of us with is, how can we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was a fantastic presentation, and it was very informative, and there were so many things in it that I wish that I could write down, but fortunately we're recording a lot of this. I'm sure that our audience has questions, have questions. Why don't we get to the Q&A?
Sure.
Does anyone have a question? If so, you can just unmute yourself and speak, or you can put your question in chat.
I thank you for your talk. It was really enjoyable. My question was, do you ever think of this question from the perspective of, is there any ethical way that we can kind of exploit these biases to get other people to question their biases?
Sure. So the ethical use of an understanding of bias to confront bias. The way I think about that is there is no such thing as neutral design. Like that's kind of what I've discovered by looking at all of this, is that because people will bring their own biases to any design you create, you cannot in fact create a neutral design. So for example, there's a thing called the serial position effect. And one of the things this does is it makes anything that's at the top of the screen seem like the most important thing, whether it actually is or not. And that's not something you are dictating, right? You're not designing with that necessarily in mind. It's something that the user is bringing to that experience. So you could randomly decide what to put at the top of the screen. It's still going to seem like the most important thing. So it now becomes more about a responsibility of saying, now that I understand this bias exists, it's on me to make sure that whatever is at the top of the screen actually is the most important thing, or the rhyming thing, right? Now that I know that something that rhymes feels more believable, okay, if I make something rhyme, it damn well better be true, right? So no matter what you're doing, you are going to be using these biases. It's not a question of, am I using bias or not? You are. You can't help it because people are going to bring those biases to it. It's more of saying, now that I know what some of these biases are, how can I use that power responsibly? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I also just from the perspective of how do we like I see every day in the world and with friends, family, and I think about biases a lot myself. But how do we actively get people to question their own biases? Like I often have, a loved one who is just as like a totally innocuous example, like you were saying at the beginning of the presentation, we're playing a game, and then they start attributing their luck to, you know, uh, some superpower, basically. Like they're able to, you know, get this many rolls in a row, so they must be like be doing something different than the rest of us, basically. um Obviously an innocuous example, but is there a way that we can try to combat that?
So what you're talking about is a very personal thing, right? Because people don't like to question their own beliefs, but bias is exactly what that demands. I find that a really good way, and something I try to use in my work, is storytelling. A good story can get you to question that you know everything, right? In an almost fun, creative way. Because the other thing, one thing most biases share in common is they're basically shortcuts to certainty. They're trying to get you to this place where you feel calm, secure, like you know everything that's going on. That's why we like to think about things in black and white. That's why your friend likes to think it's not luck, because luck is uncertain. Oh no, I'm good at this. That's certain, right? I can count on that, right? But what we have at our advantage is also the human mind also kind of likes curiosity. It likes novelty. So if you can kind of create an experience where I'm like, enjoying this thing, and like, oh, you pulled the rug out from under me. So you think about movies like The Sixth Sense or The Matrix, where there's this big reveal. People love the big reveal. Why? Because it's actually uncertain, right? But in a fun way. And it gets them to realize, oh, I didn't actually know everything that was going on there. And it was actually kind of fun, right? So if you can get people to start to engage with the idea that it can actually be fun to move at least in a little bit of uncertainty, it helps you break that habit or that addiction to certainty. So I think that's one way to think about it. And so like the reason that I use that example, the 2468 example, is because I fell for it. And when I fell for it, I was like, oh, well played, computer. You got me. Right. And like, and as soon as I'm like, you got me, I'm like, that means I'm gettable. But I enjoyed the experience of being gotten. So those kinds of experience, I think, can help bring people out of their shell of like, I must be secure, I must be certain all the time. I feel like that's a good first step. But what you're describing is a very personal journey. People sort of have to go on. It's hard for us to make them go on it. But if you can like have these stories that are an invitation to go on it, I think it starts to get the ball rolling.
No, thank you. I totally agree with that. And I would say that in my experience, I have noticed that as well. So awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Other questions?
Is there like a general template or maybe a list of questions or something that you use? Like when you're starting a project or something, is there something that you use as kind of a guideline of maybe some things that you check so that when you're starting up a project, there's just like a base list of items that you check so that you kind of know certain things that you're looking for when you start up. So like you don't miss certain base things.
Are you talking about like a way to almost kind of like bias proof the work in advance to sort of say, okay, let's make sure we're doing like a checklist, like make sure we're doing these things with the result. Yeah, sort of, right? I do like to have, and this isn't even necessarily about bias, but I do like to have what's called an objective matrix, which we got time for. I'm just going to share my screen and I'll mail this out later so people take a look. But it's a way to kind of like make sure that your goals are aligning with what you're trying to achieve. Because honestly, most biases, especially if we're talking about like a project, come from just being misaligned on what you're trying to accomplish. So I'm going to share my screen again here and show this to you. Wrong button. There we go. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So what you're seeing is an objective matrix, and basically it's just a spreadsheet that has each column having to do with different levels of specificity around a goal. So let's say we're making a marketing website. The goal, the big super goal here, all the way on the right, it's going to be increase revenue. It's a sensible goal for a marketing website. The next column over is objectives, and it's basically asking the question, okay, well, how are you going to increase revenue? Oh, we're going to drive sales leads, or we're going to increase the efficiency of the sales process. Great. Next column over strategies, and it asks the question, okay, well, how are you going to drive sales leads? Well, we could create compelling content, or we could make it easier to get in touch. The next column over is the tactics, and it's these specific, like, concrete things you're going to do. What do you mean when you say create compelling content? Well, we mean create case studies, create a newsletter, do a podcast. What do you mean when you say make it easier to get in touch? Let's improve the visibility of the call to action. Let's improve the language of the call to action, right? Then we get to the metrics, right? How do we know that any of those concrete steps, the tactics, are actually working, right? And for improve the visibility of the call to action, you can see that number of leads is the success metric. And you'll notice how much that language has in common with the objective, drive sales leads, right? That's a good metric that ties right back to the objective. Now, if you look at something here like number of case studies, that's actually a terrible metric because it tells you nothing about the objective, right? If I can make one case study that drives 10 sales leads, or I can make 10 case studies that don't drive any. The number of case studies doesn't tell me anything, but it's super easy to measure, and so it feels like a good metric. The reason I point this out is because if you don't have this in front of you, it can be really hard to say where bias is going to trip you up, right? So, sorry, let me unshare my screen again. So if you know what your goal is, it makes it a lot easier to understand where bias might actually come in and trip you up. So if we have the context of what we're trying to achieve is X, then we can have that assumption out and say, well, hey, if we're trying to achieve this, if we're trying to build an app that protects sex workers, okay, let's do an assumption out and talk about what identities are in the room, right? And as we're building out these goals and these tactics, we can say, well, we added that tactic, but we don't actually have anyone here who's literally ever been a sex worker. Does that really sound like a good idea to you? And maybe we should have them, because it doesn't just give you a way to keep track of your own progress as the project leader. It also gives you something to bring people in who have different lived experience to look at and say, does this make sense? Does this tactic actually help this strategy? Does the strategy actually help this objective, right? I feel like this is a good grounding, because if you sort of go in blindly and you're like, okay, we're going to fight bias, we're not going to have any bias in this project. Bias requires context, because all biases have context, right? We don't just sort of go around throwing bias at things. We're presented with a situation, and then the shortcut kicks in, right? It's sort of like, using Google Maps. Like a path doesn't just show up. No, you have to dial in a destination. I want to go here, and then you see all the different paths you might take. Your brain needs that. Your brain needs that objective, and then it'll start bringing in the biases of like, well, if I want to do that, I should really go this way. Okay, now we can see where the bias might come in, right? I need to hire someone for a job. Okay, quickest way to hire someone for a job is to put it on LinkedIn. And what your brain is missing is that there are a lot of qualified people who are not on LinkedIn, or maybe even don't have access to a computer, but they're actually really good at what they do, right? You start to see, but until I've said the goal is to hire someone, I don't even know what biases are going to show up. So that's why I say the good foundational first step is to draw something like this, where at least you know what your primary objectives are and how you think you're going to get there. And then you can test that by doing the assumption audit, by bringing in other people who are not like you, who might be impacted by that, to vet that approach. But that's why I would start with something like an objective matrix. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah, that does. Thank you so much.
Sure.
David, you had many examples of how you would mitigate some of these cognitive biases. I was wondering if you could give an example of, let's say, a difficulty or an obstacle when a team tries to mitigate a bias.
So you mean in terms of impact, like in terms of pushback to trying to mitigate it, or like you're trying to mitigate it but something gets in the way? Like, tell me more what you mean.
Well, like if for example, if you're trying to to mitigate a bias in a team, or potentially avoid a bias, or trying to think of ways that the user might approach the product or an interface with a bias that would lead to, suboptimal judgments. You showed us many different ways to do this, and that was really cool, that the chart that you just showed. So I was wondering, can you think of an obstacle or a challenge as you went about doing that?
So what I find, and this is drawn as much from people who have done participatory design, or people who have done red team, blue team, we are the ones who actually get in our own way. So for example, the first person I learned about red team, blue team from did it in an environment where the people who were asked to be the red team were really bad at it. Not because they weren't capable of thinking of bad scenarios, but because it was impolite to do so. Like, it's really hard if you're not used to critiquing, being given permission to critique something at like a fundamental ethical level, to just come in and do it, because you feel like a jerk, right? It's like, so it's really important to set the table and sort of be like, no, your job, what we need from you right now in this instance is to come in and help us and poke holes in this. Like, that is what we want from you right now. You are doing a public service. And it can be hard to adjust to that role if it's something you're not used to. Some people love to do that, but some people don't, right? Some people are like, no, it feels weird to critique this work here. And it can help even to sort of be like, it's okay, next week we're going to critique your work. We'll trade off, right? But you want to make it clear that it is in fact the person to do that. So that's one thing. That's one way we can get in our own way when we're trying to do these practices. Another way that we can get in our own way is really perfect being the enemy of good. I've had a lot of people who are afraid to engage in any of these practices because what if they get it wrong? And what if the people they're trying to help yell at them? Like, seriously, what if I'm trying to do something and create a more inclusive product and it ships and I took all the right steps and there's still people who are like, yeah, but you didn't do this. And they're like, you're right, we didn't do that. I feel terrible, right? And the fear of that can keep people from proceeding. And what I tell people, and this is a lesson I've had to learn, and it's a very hard lesson, is that you are not going to be the hero. If you decide to engage with inclusive design, I can guarantee you are not going to be the hero, because the people you are trying to help, the targets of oppression, do not agree on how you should help them. Like, think about that for a second. The targets of oppression are not a monolith. Black people are not a monolith. Black people do not agree on what it means to meaningfully help Black people. LGBTQ folks do not agree on what it means to meaningfully help LGBTQ folks. So there's literally nothing you can do that isn't going to piss some people off, specifically the people you're trying to help. Like, that is a, for Star Trek fans, a Kobayashi Maru. That is an unwinnable situation. But you have to decide that you want to help. What is worse, what's going to help even less is if you do nothing. So you have to sort of get into it for the right reasons, I guess, where it's sort of like you're willing to say, okay, this is what we have to decide is an acceptable amount of help. And we also have to be willing to say, as we do that, we're going to learn and we're going to try to help more people in the next iteration of this. I mean, it's basic lean startup methodology or agile methodology, whatever you want to call it, but it's the build, measure, learn, right? We're going to put this out there and we're going to put it out in the most ethical way we know how, knowing that there's some things we're going to miss, but there are some things we're going to hit, and we're going to try to build on those things each time. But the fear of like even taking any step is actually very problematic. And that is something I see a lot of. And again, to your question, I think that actually is one of the bigger problems we're into. It's like not the methods themselves that can have problems. It's the willingness to take the risk involved with those methods.
Thank you. Let's see if our audience has any other questions. Any other questions? Well, we are 1 minute past 8, and it is 9 o'clock on the East Coast where David is. So I'd like to thank David for a fantastic presentation for tonight's event. And If you are willing to, we would love to have the slides as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll send that along. And I have a resource sheet I'll send you, and also a link to that little chart I showed you so you can try that yourself.
Great. And the video will be available on our MediaSpace website. And for the audience, if you need the link to go to the video library, you can email me. And thank you all for coming. And thanks again, David.
Thank you.
Good night.